By the time he was 5 years old, Amos knew he was going to be a scientist. That's when he got his first wheelchair, and he was already pondering ways to make the wheels spin faster and the brakes grab harder. Now that he was in middle school, his experiments had earned top honors in every science fair. Sometimes, though, he experimented just for fun, and that's what he was doing today. For this experiment, Amos chose one of those disgusting cheeses that smell like old sneakers. The green mold around the edges didn't add to its appeal either, but Amos figured the mold would work well for his test. Amos poured a mixture of seaweed extract and gelatin into a petri dish, one of those round, flat glass dishes used in chemistry labs. The mixture made a perfect environment to grow bacteria. After the gelatin hardened, he scraped a bit of the green mold on top of it. Then he covered the petri dish and wheeled over to the microwave. He put the dish into the microwave, punched low power, set the timer for 5 seconds, and hit start. He didn't want to kill the mold bacteria, just warm it so it would grow faster. He was also curious about whether the exposure to microwave rays would affect the bacteria. Would the cells change, or just curl up and die? Amos removed the petri dish from the microwave, scraped the bacteria off the seaweed culture, and spread it onto 2 glass slides. He wheeled back to his microscope and slipped the slides under the lens. Curious, Amos thought as he studied the bacteria. The cells hadn't died. In fact, they were moving around the slides like skaters on ice. Before recording what he observed in his experiment's log, Amos tried counting the cells with a special handheld counter, but there were too many. Rapid increase in number, he wrote. Then he returned the petri dish to the microwave and set the timer for 10 more seconds. Ping! Amos looked at the results under the microscope and observed that the cells were much bigger now. In fact, they had taken on a whole new structure. They looked like tiny green bears in fuzzy hats that were rushing around, bumping into each other. They were hopping off the edge of the slide and scurrying across the kitchen counter. Amos carefully recorded all of this in his log. The bear creatures continued to grow, and now they were large enough to be seen through a regular magnifying glass. Some of them headed for the refrigerator and slipped through a crack around the door. Others invaded the cupboard and attacked a box of breakfast cereal. Amos added to his log. The creatures seemed to navigate by a sense of smell. What originally looked like a hat is actually a nose. That figures, he thought, remembering the stinky cheese. By this time, the bear creatures from the first slide had escaped and were growing too, but not as fast. Those from the second slide ran right over them. Aggressive behavior, Amos jotted down in his log. The bears found a tub of butter and started to mold it into tiny balls, which they threw at each other. Amos continued to observe as his experiment took over the kitchen. A mob of little green bear creatures was now exploring a stack of dishes. Amos shook a few drops of vinegar onto the bears and watched as they shriveled up. Negative response to sour solution, he wrote. Meanwhile, the creatures were growing bigger and more aggressive every second, and Amos could now see them without his magnifying glass. He used a ruler to measure one. It was about 1/4 of an inch long, and it was starting to smell, just like stinky cheese. Amos's mother would be home any minute. It was time to terminate the experiment and get rid of all the specimens before she saw them. But how? The solution came to Amos in a flash. He soaked a dish towel in vinegar and wheeled around the kitchen, cleaning the counters and appliances. Then he grabbed a mop, sprinkled it with vinegar, and wiped down the walls and floor. The kitchen was spotless by the time Mom came through the door. She sniffed the vinegary air. "Another one of your experiments?" "Mm-hmm," Amos mumbled and wheeled out of the room. As Mom unpacked the groceries, she smiled proudly, thinking of what an extraordinary young scientist Amos had become and how much pleasure his experiments gave him. As long as he didn't brew up any real trouble, she didn't mind a funny smell now and then. She opened a window to air out the kitchen, put the kettle on for tea, and left to change her shoes. The kitchen stood empty and still. The clock ticked. The curtain stirred, and the tea kettle began to hiss. Behind the refrigerator, something moved. It was wearing a fuzzy hat, and it was growing bigger and bigger.